Corinne Ashworth stood outside the county clerk's office with a manila folder pressed against her chest, and inside that folder was a piece of paper that would end her ex-husband's marriage before the ink on his new wedding certificate had even dried. 3 weeks earlier, Wallace Depree had walked Priya Delgado through the front door of the Larkspur House as his bride. He'd given a toast about building a life from the ground up, about how every board and beam in that house told the story of his hard work. He didn't know a deed filed 41 years ago said otherwise. He didn't know that in 9 days, a woman he'd once promised forever to would hand him a certified copy of a record that had been sitting in a county archive the entire time, untouched, waiting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Corinne had lived in Briar Hollow, Vermont, her whole life, and for 11 of those years she'd lived inside a marriage that slowly hollowed itself out from middle. She was 44 now, divorced 14 months, and renting a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on Session Street that smelled faintly of paint thinner no matter how many windows she opened. The Larkspur House sat 6 miles outside town on a gravel road lined with sugar maples, a farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that Wallace had rebuilt himself the summer they got married. Corinne had planted the lilac bushes along the front walk. She'd chosen the color of the shutters. She'd spent a decade making that house feel like something worth coming home to. And then Wallace had asked for the divorce on a Tuesday in March, standing in the kitchen with his coat still on. The split had been quiet on paper and brutal in every other way. Wallace's lawyer, a sharp, unbothered man named Trent Vasilenko, had structured the settlement so that Wallace kept the house outright. Corinne had been too exhausted to fight it. She'd been working double shifts at the regional hospital where she managed patient billing, coming home most nights too tired to do anything but sit in the dark of her new apartment and wonder how 11 years of her life had folded into a single signature. Wallace had always talked about the Larkspur House like it was a monument to his own persistence, something he'd wrestled out of the earth through sheer will. He never mentioned the fact that the land itself, the 6 acres the house sat on, had come from Corinne's side of the family before either of them had ever met. That detail hadn't seemed to matter at the time. Marriages blur ownership. Things get folded into a shared life until nobody remembers whose name was on what to begin with. And Corinne herself had half forgotten the particulars. Her grandmother, Odile Ashworth, had left her a small parcel of land outside Briar Hollow back when Corinne was 23, years before she'd even met Wallace. The paperwork had been handled by a family friend, filed away, and never revisited. Corinne remembered signing something once, early in the marriage, when Wallace wanted to build the house on that land instead of buying property elsewhere. She remembered him saying it would be simpler, cleaner, faster if the whole thing went through his contractor's name for the construction loan. She'd trusted him. She always had. Then, 6 weeks ago, she'd heard through her cousin Fern Calloway that Wallace was getting remarried and that the wedding would be held at the Larkspur House itself, on the same porch Corinne had helped design. Something about that detail sat wrong in her chest for days. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the particular sting of watching someone build a new life directly on top of the one you'd lost, using the same materials, the same address, like none of it had ever belonged to you at all. Fern lived 2 towns over and worked part-time at a diner, where half of Briar Hollow ended up eventually, which meant she heard things. She was the one who mentioned, almost as an aside over coffee, that her neighbor Ottoline Reyes worked in the county records office and had pulled some old land documents for an unrelated dispute the month before. Fern didn't think anything of it. Corinne did. She couldn't say exactly why the comment lodged itself in her mind. But that night, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her, trying to remember the exact wording of the paperwork she'd signed all those years ago. She dug through a box of old files she'd kept from the divorce, mostly out of habit rather than any real plan. Buried near the bottom was a folder labeled Grandma, Oh Land, a folder she hadn't opened since her grandmother's funeral. Inside was a copy of the original deed transfer, dated the spring Corinne turned 23, naming her as sole owner of the 6-acre parcel on Larkspur Road. There was no mention of Wallace anywhere on it. There never had been. Corinne sat with that piece of paper for a long time. Outside, a truck rumbled past on Session Street, and somewhere below her apartment, the hardware store's bell jingled as someone came in. She thought about Wallace standing on that porch in 9 days, promising Priya a lifetime in a house he believed he'd earned. She thought about Trent Vasilenko's smug confidence during the divorce proceedings, the way he'd waved off her modest requests like they were an inconvenience to be managed. She thought about 11 years of quietly stepping aside so Wallace could take up more space, and how she'd let that habit follow her even after the marriage ended. She folded the deed carefully and placed it back in the folder, and for the first time in over a year, Corinne Ashworth felt something other than grief. She felt the particular, focused calm of a person who has just realized she isn't finished yet. Corinne didn't sleep much that night. She kept the deed folder open on her kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, rereading the same 3 lines until the words stopped looking like words. By the time she finally went to bed, she made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like something that had already decided itself. She needed to find out exactly what her marriage paperwork had actually said about that land, and she needed to do it quietly. The trouble was money, the way it always seemed to be lately. Corinne's job at Briar Hollow Regional paid enough to cover rent and groceries and not much beyond that. The divorce had left her with a modest settlement, most of which had gone toward paying off a shared credit card Wallace had run up during the last 2 years of the marriage without telling her. She was still paying off a chunk of that debt now, in installments, to a bank that sent reminder notices every month like clockwork. Hiring a real estate attorney to look into old land records felt like the kind of thing other people could afford. People with savings. People without an ex-husband's name, still tangled somewhere in their finances. She thought about asking Fern for advice, but Fern's expertise began and ended with knowing everyone's business in Briar Hollow, not knowing what to do with a decades-old deed. So Corinne did what she always did when she didn't know where to start. She made a list. Find the original construction loan documents. Find whatever she'd signed when Wallace built the house. Find out whose name was actually on the county records for that parcel now, 41 years after her grandmother had first transferred it to her. That last part turned out to be harder than it should have been. Vermont county records were public, technically, but Corinne had no idea how to navigate the request forms, the reference numbers, the microfiche archives that hadn't been digitized. She spent a lunch break at the hospital trying to search the county's online portal and got nowhere. The system wanted a parcel ID number she didn't have. It wanted a document number from a filing she couldn't remember. She closed the browser tab feeling exactly as small as Trent Vasilenko had once made her feel across a conference table, back when he'd explained to her, slowly, like she might not follow otherwise, why the house had to go to Wallace. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 days later, Wallace called her. He almost never called anymore, not since the divorce, so Corinne answered with her stomach already tight before he said a word. "I need you to sign something," he said, without so much as a greeting. "The construction company that built the addition on the house, back in year 3, they're saying there's a lien issue on their end. Paperwork thing. Shouldn't take you 5 minutes." "What paperwork?" Corinne said. "Just a form confirming the original loan was satisfied." Trent's got it ready. You can swing by his office whenever. Corinne felt something shift into focus. Wallace wasn't asking her to sign something out of courtesy. He needed her signature for a reason, and the only reason that made sense was that somewhere, buried in the tangle of loan documents and construction paperwork from 40 years back, her name was attached to that land in a way that still mattered legally. If it hadn't mattered, he wouldn't have called. "I'll think about it," she said, and hung up before he could push. She didn't think about it for long. That evening she drove to Fern's place instead of home, and Fern, sensing something was wrong the moment Corinne walked in still wearing her hospital badge, poured 2 glasses of wine and sat her down at the kitchen table. "Wallace wants me to sign something," Corinne said, "related to the house." He wouldn't say exactly what. Fern's eyebrows went up. "And you think it's about the land?" "I think it's about the land." Fern was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly on the table. Then she said, "You remember I mentioned Otto Line works the county records desk?" Corinne remembered. She'd barely registered it at the time, a passing comment over coffee weeks earlier, but now it sat in her mind with a different weight entirely. Would she look something up? Unofficially, I mean, just to point me in the right direction. Corinne, Fern set the glass down. She's not going to break any laws for you. But pulling a public deed record isn't breaking any laws. That's literally her job. Corinne exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly for the first time in days. It wasn't a solution yet. It wasn't proof of anything. But it was a door, and after 14 months of feeling like every door in her life had already closed, that alone felt like more than she'd had in a long time. She thought about Wallace's voice on the phone, clipped and businesslike, asking for a 5-minute favor like she owed him one. She thought about Priya, somewhere out at the Larkspur House right now, probably picking out curtains for a bedroom Corinne had once painted herself. And she thought, not for the first time, about how confident Wallace had always sounded about things he'd never actually checked. Call her, Corinne said. Ask her if she has time this week. Autoline Reyes had a small office in the back corner of the Briar Hollow County Clerk's building, tucked behind rows of filing cabinets that hadn't been touched since the county switched to digital archiving sometime in the early 2000s, and even then, only halfway. She was younger than Corinne expected, maybe 30, with the brisk efficiency of someone who spent her days fielding requests from people who didn't understand how records worked. Fern had set up the meeting for a Thursday afternoon, framing it to Autoline as a favor for a friend trying to sort out some old family property questions, which wasn't exactly a lie. So you're looking for a parcel transfer, Autoline said, once Corinne had explained the basics, leaving out most of the parts about Wallace and Priya and the wedding. From your grandmother's estate. Do you have the original deed? Corinne slid the folder across the desk. Autoline studied it for a moment, then typed something into her computer, her expression unreadable. Okay, this gives me the original parcel ID. Let me see what's attached to it now. She clicked through a few screens, frowning slightly. This is going to take a minute. Some of the older filings on this parcel are still on microfiche. We didn't finish digitizing everything past a certain point. Corinne sat in the small plastic chair across from the desk and waited, watching Autoline's face for any flicker of reaction. 15 minutes passed. Autoline excused herself twice to pull physical files from the archive room down the hall, coming back each time with a thin folder of yellowed paper that she added to a growing stack on her desk. Okay, Autoline said finally, sitting back. I want to walk you through this carefully, because I think it's more complicated than a simple property question. Corinne's stomach tightened. Go ahead. So the original transfer from your grandmother to you? That's clean. Straightforward gift deed. 1983. No liens, no conditions. You've owned this parcel outright since you were 23 years old. Autoline paused, flipping to the next document in the stack. Now, about 8 years later, there's a construction loan filed against the parcel. That's presumably for the house being built. The loan is in your name and your husband's name jointly, which is normal for a marital construction loan at the time. Right, Corinne said. That part one remember. Here's where it gets interesting. The loan was paid off in full 11 years ago. Once a construction loan is satisfied, the lien against the property is supposed to be released, but the underlying ownership of the land itself doesn't change just because the loan is gone. The land title stays with whoever held it before the loan was filed. Autoline turned the folder around so Corinne could see it herself. Which is you. It's always been you. Nobody ever filed a deed, transfer, moving ownership of the parcel to your ex-husband. Not during the marriage, not during the divorce. Corinne stared at the document, the county seal stamped faintly in one corner, her own name typed in a font that looked decades out of date. But the divorce settlement gave him the house. The divorce settlement can say whatever it wants about who gets to live there or who's responsible for the mortgage payments, Autoline said. But a settlement agreement isn't a deed. If nobody filed a quitclaim deed transferring the land itself out of your name during the divorce, then legally, on paper, at the county level, you still own the ground that house is sitting on. The house structure might be a separate conversation, depending on how the construction loan and any subsequent refinancing was worded, but the land underneath it, the actual 6 acres that's registered to you and has been since 1983. Corinne felt the room tilt slightly, not from shock exactly, but from the sudden, dizzying realization that something she'd assumed was permanently lost had, in fact, never left her hands at all. Is it possible there's a more recent filing you haven't found yet? Something that supersedes this? It's possible, Autoline admitted. I want to check for any refinancing paperwork from after the divorce, and I want to see exactly what the settlement agreement said, word for word, about the property. But based on what's in front of me right now, nothing here shows your ownership of that parcel ever being legally transferred to anyone else. Corinne sat with that for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a phone ringing unanswered somewhere down the hall. She thought about Wallace's call 2 days earlier, the clipped request for a signature, the vague mention of a lien issue from the construction company. It made a different kind of sense now. Someone, somewhere in that process, had noticed the same gap Autoline had just found, and Wallace was trying to close it quietly before anyone else did. I need copies of everything, Corinne said. Everything you just showed me. I can get you certified copies. It'll take a few days for the official versions, but I can print you working copies right now. Autoline was already reaching for the printer tray. Corinne, can I ask, does your ex-husband know about any of this? No, Corinne said, but I think he's starting to suspect it. She left the clerk's office 20 minutes later with a thick folder under her arm, walking out into a gray Vermont afternoon that felt sharper and clearer than it had in months. Somewhere out on Larkspur Road, Wallace was likely finalizing seating charts for a wedding on a piece of land he didn't legally own, married to a woman who had no idea that the ground beneath her future home had never belonged to the man who'd promised it to her. Corinne spent the drive home replaying Adeline's words, trying to fit them against her own memory of those early years with Wallace. And the more she turned it over, the more she realized how little she'd actually understood about her own marriage, even while she was living inside it. She'd been 23 when her grandmother Odile passed, young enough that the inheritance had felt more like an abstraction than a responsibility. Odile Ashworth had been a schoolteacher for 30 years in Briar Hollow, frugal and sharp-toned, the kind of woman who kept every receipt and distrusted anyone who talked too smoothly. She'd bought the 6 acres on Larkspur Road decades earlier as an investment, back when land out that way sold for almost nothing, and she'd left it to Corinne specifically, not to Corinne's mother, not split among the family, because as she'd put it once at a Thanksgiving dinner years before her death, the girl's the only one who won't sell it the first time she's short on rent. Corinne had met Wallace 2 years after that, at a mutual friend's barbecue, and he'd been charming in the specific way that men who are used to being liked are charming. He worked in construction management, had an easy laugh, remembered small details about people after meeting them once. When they got serious, when marriage started coming up in conversation, Wallace had been the one to suggest building on the Larkspur parcel instead of buying somewhere else. It made sense at the time. The land was already hers, free and clear, no mortgage to worry about on the ground itself. All they'd need was a construction loan for the house. She remembered sitting in a bank office in downtown Briar Hollow, 26 years old, signing a stack of papers Wallace had already reviewed with the loan officer before she arrived. She remembered him saying, casually, that it would be simpler if the loan and the eventual title paperwork ran primarily through his name, since he was the one managing the build and dealing with the contractors day to day. She remembered thinking it sounded reasonable. She remembered not reading every page as closely as she probably should have, trusting that Wallace, who worked in construction for a living, understood these documents better than she did. What she hadn't understood then, and what Adeline's records now made clear, was that the construction loan and the land title were 2 entirely separate legal instruments. Wallace could be listed on a loan without ever actually holding a claim to the ground itself. Somewhere in the years since, whether through carelessness or convenient assumption, everyone involved, Wallace included, seemed to have simply forgotten that distinction. The house got built. The mortgage got paid down and eventually satisfied. Corinne planted lilacs and picked shutter colors and hosted Thanksgivings on that porch for a decade. And not once in all that time did anyone file the paperwork that would have actually made the land Wallace's. Sitting in her apartment that night, the certified copies spread across her kitchen table, Corinne found herself thinking about Trent Vasilenko during the divorce proceedings, how confidently he'd walked through the settlement terms, how he'd framed the house as an obvious, uncontested asset belonging to his client. She wondered now whether Trent had actually checked the title history at all, or whether he'd simply assumed, the way everyone else had, that 10 years of marriage and a paid-off construction loan meant ownership had transferred somewhere along the way. Assumptions, it turned out, weren't the same thing as deeds. Her phone buzzed around 9 that evening. It was Wallace again, and this time his voice had an edge to it that hadn't been there during the first call. "Did you go down to the county clerk's office?" he asked, no preamble. Corinne felt her pulse pick up, but kept her voice even. "Why would you ask that?" "Trent got a call today," said someone at the records office, flagged an inquiry on the Larkspur parcel. A pause. "Corinne, if this is about you being upset over the wedding, there are better ways to handle it than digging through old paperwork." "I'm not upset about the wedding," she said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was mostly true. "I'm curious why you need me to sign something about a lien on land you're telling everyone you built yourself." The line went quiet for a moment. "It's a formality," Wallace said finally, his tone shifting towards something more careful. "Trent just wants to clean up some old paperwork before the wedding, tie up loose ends. It's nothing you need to worry about. Then you won't mind if I take my time reading it before I sign anything." Another pause, longer this time. "Fine, take your time, but don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." After he hung up, Corinne sat at her table for a long while, looking at the deed with her grandmother's careful signature witnessed at the bottom, dated in a year when Corinne had been too young to understand what she'd actually been given. Odile had left her more than a piece of land. She'd left her the one thing in this entire marriage and divorce that nobody else had ever thought to check, the one thing that had been sitting quietly in a county archive the whole time, waiting for someone to finally look. Corinne picked up her phone and called Fern back. "I need a real estate attorney," she said. "Someone good. Someone who isn't afraid of Trent Vasilenko." Fern knew someone, of course. Fern always knew someone. Her cousin's husband had used a lawyer out of Montpelier 2 years earlier during a boundary dispute with a neighbor, and by all accounts the man had been thorough, unflashy, and immune to the kind of intimidation Trent Vasilenko specialized in. His name was Desmond Okafor, and when Corinne called his office the next morning, his assistant told her he could see her Friday afternoon, which felt like both an eternity and no time at all. She spent the days in between doing her best to keep working normal shifts at the hospital while her mind stayed 6 miles outside town, circling the Larkspur House like a hawk that hadn't decided yet whether to strike. Wallace didn't call again, but Trent did, on Wednesday, his voice carrying the same smooth, unhurried confidence she remembered from the divorce proceedings. "Corinne, I wanted to touch base directly," Trent said. "I understand you've had some questions about the property records. I want to reassure you there's nothing unusual going on. Old paperwork sometimes has gaps. It's common with properties this age. Nothing that would actually affect the settlement you and Wallace already agreed to." "If it's nothing unusual," Corinne said, "then you won't mind if I have my own attorney look at it before I sign anything." There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable. "Of course. That's your right. I just hate for this to drag out and create unnecessary tension, especially with the wedding so close. Wallace has a lot on his plate right now." Corinne almost laughed at that, the sheer audacity of being asked to make things easier for the man who was marrying someone else in a house built on land she'd never stopped owning. "I'm sure he does," she said, and ended the call before Trent could say anything else. Friday arrived, and Desmond Okafor's office turned out to be a modest space above a bakery in downtown Montpelier, nothing like the polished conference room where Trent had once laid out the divorce terms like he was doing her a favor. Desmond himself was maybe 50, unhurried in his movements, the kind of person who read every document twice before speaking. Corinne handed him the folder, the certified copies from Autoline, the original 1983 deed, everything. He was quiet for nearly 10 minutes, flipping through pages, occasionally making a note on a legal pad. Corinne sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, trying not to fill the silence with nervous questions. "This is a pretty clean paper trail," Desmond said eventually. "Whoever handled your grandmother's estate did it correctly. The land transfer in 1983 is airtight. No conditions, no reversionary clause, No shared title. It's yours, full stop. He tapped the construction loan documents. This loan, the one from when the house was built, this is what everyone's been treating as proof of ownership. But a loan document isn't a deed. It never transferred title. It just financed construction on land you already owned. So during the divorce, Corinne said carefully, when the settlement gave the house to Wallace. The settlement agreement is a contract between the two of you about how to divide marital assets, and typically it would include instructions to execute whatever deed transfers are necessary to actually carry that division out. Somebody was supposed to file a quitclaim deed, moving your interest in the land over to Wallace, to make the settlement match reality on paper. Desmond set the papers down. Based on everything in front of me, that never happened. Either it was overlooked, or somebody assumed the construction loan paperwork already covered it, which is a mistake I see more often than you'd think in property this old. Either way, as of right now, the land remains legally yours. The house sitting on it becomes a more complicated question, since it was built during the marriage with joint funds. But the ground underneath, the thing that actually matters for who has the right to be there, that's you. Corinne felt something settle in her chest. Not quite triumph. Something steadier and more complicated than that. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen, Desmond said. You could pursue a formal correction, essentially forcing the paperwork to catch up with reality, which could take months and would likely mean going back to court to reopen aspects of the settlement. Or, given that you own the land outright and nobody transfer that ownership, you're in a considerably stronger negotiating position than you were a month ago. Your ex-husband and his lawyer clearly already suspect something, given the call about the lien and the sudden urgency to get your signature on something. They're trying to get me to sign away my claim before I understand what it's worth, Corinne said slowly. That would be my read on it too, Desmond said. Whatever that document Trent wants you to sign actually says, I want to review it very carefully before you go anywhere near it. My guess is it's designed to look like a routine formality while actually functioning as a retroactive quitclaim. Corinne thought about Wallace's voice on the phone, the careful way he downplayed the whole thing, the wedding invitations probably already sitting in mailboxes across Briar Hollow with the Larkspur House listed as the venue. She thought about Priya, who she'd never actually met, who had no idea any of this was happening. I want the document, Corinne said. Whatever Trent sends over, I want you to see it first. Desmond nodded, already reaching for a fresh legal pad. Good instinct. And Corinne, one more thing. Don't go out to that property alone until we've sorted through this. Not because anything unsafe would happen, but because possession and access can matter in ways that get complicated if this ends up back in front of judge. Let's keep everything clean. She left his office with a plan for the first time in weeks. A folder now considerably thicker than the one she'd walked in with, and the distinct feeling that the ground, quite literally, had shifted back beneath her feet. The document arrived by courier the following Monday, addressed to Corinne directly instead of going through Desmond, which struck her as its own kind of message. She didn't open it. She photographed the sealed envelope, texted the photo to Desmond, and drove it straight to his office in Montpelier without so much as breaking the flap. Desmond read it at his desk while Corinne waited, the same unhurried pace as before, though this time his eyebrows lifted slightly about halfway through. This is worse than I expected, he said. It's framed as a lien satisfaction acknowledgement, tied to the original construction loan. But buried in the third paragraph, there's language that would have you affirming Wallace's, quote, sole and complete ownership interest in the entire Larkspur Road property, unquote. If you'd signed this without reading it carefully, you'd have handed over any claim to the land voluntarily, in writing, with a notary stamp. It would have made this whole conversation moot. Trent wrote that knowing I'd probably skim it, Corinne said, because that's what I did the last time. I can't speak to his intentions, Desmond said, which Corinne understood was a lawyer's careful way of saying yes, obviously. But I can draft a response making clear you won't be signing anything and that you're aware of the discrepancy in the county records. Sometimes that's enough to change the tone of a negotiation entirely. It didn't take long to find out. 2 days later, Wallace showed up at Corinne's apartment unannounced, something he hadn't done since before the divorce was finalized. She saw him through the window before he knocked, standing on the sidewalk outside the hardware store looking up at her window like he wasn't entirely sure this was still where she lived. "You could have called," she said, opening the door but not stepping back to let him in. "You wouldn't have answered." He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen on him in years, the confidence from their phone calls noticeably absent now that he was standing in front of her. "Corinne, can we talk? Just for a few minutes." She let him in, mostly out of curiosity, and gestured toward the small kitchen table where the folder of records had sat for over a week now. "Trent told me what your lawyer said," Wallace began, sitting down without being asked. "About the land, about the deed never being transferred." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I didn't know, Corinne. I swear to you, I genuinely thought that once the construction loan was paid off, the whole property was just mine. Ours, then mine after the divorce. Nobody ever told me there was a separate step that didn't happen." "Would it have mattered if you'd known?" Corinne asked. "Back during the divorce, I mean. Would you have handled it differently?" Wallace didn't answer right away, and the silence told her more than anything he could have said. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Probably not. I wanted the house. I built most of it with my own hands, Corinne. I know the land was your grandmother's, but I put 4 years of my life into that structure. You put 4 years into a house sitting on 6 acres you never bothered to actually own," Corinne said, not unkindly but not softening it either. "That's the part you keep skipping past. It's not just an oversight that happened to work out in your favor. It's an oversight that let you tell everyone, including your new wife, a story about the house that was never entirely true." Wallace flinched at that, and for a moment Corinne almost felt sorry for him. Watching the story he'd told himself for years start to come apart in real time. "Almost. Priya doesn't know any of this," he said quietly. "That's not my problem to manage. The wedding's in 6 days. That's also not my problem to manage." He sat there a moment longer, and Corinne watched him search for some angle, some version of the conversation where he came out ahead the way he usually did. She recognized the look. She'd seen it during their marriage more times than she could count. That particular calculation behind his eyes when things weren't going his way. "What do you want, Corinne? Money? For me to buy the land off you outright? Name a number. I want you to understand that you don't get to threaten a woman into signing away something that's legally hers, and then act surprised when it doesn't work," she said. "Beyond that, I haven't decided yet what I want. But I can tell you what I don't want. I don't want another conversation where you or Trent try to make me feel like I'm the one being unreasonable." Wallace left without much else to say, and Corinne stood at her window watching him walk back to his car, the same easy confidence from all those years ago noticeably gone from his shoulders. She thought about Priya out at the Larkspur House right now, maybe finishing wedding preparations, completely unaware that the ground beneath the venue had a name on it that wasn't her fiancé's. She called Desmond that evening. "I want to talk about options," she said. "Real ones. Not just defending against what they're trying to do to me. What I could actually do with this." "Now we're getting somewhere," Desmond said. Desmond laid out 3 paths during their call, and Corinne wrote each one down on the back of an envelope while she listened, the phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear. The first was the slow route, a formal petition to correct the county records and force a legal reckoning of exactly who owned what, which could take the better part of a year and would almost certainly mean returning to family court to reopen parts of a settlement she'd hoped never to think about again. The second was a negotiated buyout, where Wallace would essentially have to purchase the land from her at fair market value if he wanted to keep the house standing on it, which meant appraisals, more lawyers, more months of waiting. The third path was the one that made Corinne go quiet on the phone for a long moment before she finally spoke. "Or I could just show up," she said. "Show up where?" Desmond asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The wedding. Or before it. I don't know yet." She turned the envelope over in her hands. "I'm not talking about causing a scene. I mean, I could go to Priya directly, before any of this becomes a legal mess dragged through a courtroom, and just tell her what the county records actually say. Let her make an informed decision about the life she's about to build." Desmond was quiet for a moment. "That's not really a legal strategy, Corinne. That's a personal one. I can't advise you on it either way, but I caution you that anything you say to her could theoretically become relevant if this ends up in litigation. Keep it factual. documents, not accusations. Corinne thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it during her shifts at the hospital, entering insurance codes on autopilot, while her mind stayed fixed on a woman she'd never met. She thought about it lying awake at night, replaying the version of herself who had once trusted Wallace's easy confidence without question, who had signed papers without reading every line, who had let an entire decade of her life get quietly rearranged by someone else's assumptions. She didn't want Priya to become another version of that same story. In the end, she didn't have to make the decision herself. Priya called her first. The number came in on a Wednesday evening, a Vermont area code Corinne didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "Is this Corinne Ashworth?" The voice was careful, hesitant, older sounding than Corinne had pictured. "My name is Priya. I'm marrying Wallace on Saturday. I think you already know that." Corinne sat down slowly at her kitchen table. "I know that. I wasn't going to call you. Wallace would be furious if he knew I was calling you." A pause, the sound of a door closing somewhere on Priya's end, like she was moving to a quieter room. "But Trent came by the house yesterday, and he and Wallace had this whole conversation in the study that they thought I couldn't hear about paperwork and county records and needing to, quote, resolve the land issue before Saturday. And when I asked Wallace about it directly, he told me it was nothing, just old divorce business, and I should let the lawyers handle it." Her voice tightened. "I've been married before, Mrs. Ashworth. My first husband used to tell me things were nothing, too, right up until they turn out to be everything." Corinne closed her eyes for a moment. "It's Ms. now, and I appreciate you calling, but I need to be careful about what I say to you, legally speaking. I'm not asking you to break any laws," Priya said. "I'm asking you, one woman to another, is there something about that house I should know before I marry him in it on Saturday?" Corinne thought about Desmond's warning, keep it factual, documents, not accusations, and found there was actually a way to answer honestly without crossing any line she shouldn't. "The land the house sits on was left to me by my grandmother in 1983, she said carefully. "It has never been legally transferred to Wallace, not during our marriage, not during the divorce. County records confirm this. I have certified copies." Wallace was recently made aware of this fact, which is likely what that conversation you overheard was about. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Corinne wondered if the call had dropped. "He's been telling everyone he built that house from nothing," Priya finally said, her voice flat. "His whole toast at the engagement party was about it. Built with his own hands, on his own land." "He built the house," Corinne said. "The land is a different matter entirely. Why didn't you say anything sooner, before all this got so far along?" "I didn't know myself until a few weeks ago," Corinne said. "I found an old deed almost by accident. Nobody had bothered to check it in over a decade, including me." Another long pause. "I need to think," Priya said finally. "Thank you for being honest with me. I know you didn't have to be." After she hung up, Corinne sat at her table for a long time, the envelope full of notes still sitting in front of her, the 3 paths Desmond had laid out no longer feeling like the only options in play. Somewhere out at the Larkspur House, a conversation was likely happening right now that had nothing to do with lawyers or courtrooms and everything to do with a woman deciding how much truth she could build a marriage on top of. The wedding didn't happen on Saturday. Corinne heard about it secondhand, through Fern, who heard it from someone at the diner, who'd heard it from a cousin who did flowers for the event and had already delivered $200 of scent centerpieces to the Larkspur House before getting a call that the whole thing was off. By the time Corinne pieced together the full story over the following week, it had taken on the slightly exaggerated shape that stories always do once they've passed through enough hands in a small town, but the core of it held steady no matter who was telling it. Priya had confronted Wallace the morning after her call to Corinne, sitting him down in the kitchen he'd once described in a magazine feature about local craftsmen as built plank by plank with my own 2 hands. She'd asked him directly whether the land underneath that kitchen actually belonged to him. He hadn't lied to her outright, according to what Fern heard, but he hadn't told her the whole truth either, and Priya had apparently decided that the space between those 2 things was reason enough to postpone. Corinne didn't feel triumphant when she heard. She felt something quieter than that, something closer to relief, the particular relief of watching a pattern break instead of repeat. Desmond called her 2 days after the postponement with an update of his own. Trent had reached out, notably subdued, requesting a meeting to discuss what he called a reasonable path forward for all parties. The meeting happened the following week in Desmond's modest office above the bakery. Trent seated across the table, looking considerably less polished than he had during the divorce proceedings, Wallace beside him, quiet in a way Corinne had never once seen him during their entire marriage. The terms, when they finally came together, weren't complicated once everyone stopped pretending the county records said something other than what they actually said. Wallace would pay Corinne fair market value for the 6 acres, an amount Desmond had insisted on having independently appraised rather than accepting whatever number Trent proposed first. In exchange, Corinne would sign a deed formally transferring the land, closing the gap that should have been closed 11 years earlier. It took another 6 weeks of back and forth to finalize, but by early autumn, Corinne stood again in Adeline's small office at the county clerk's building, this time to file the paperwork herself, watching her grandmother's old parcel officially change hand for the first time in 41 years. She used part of the settlement to pay off the last of the credit card debt Wallace had left her with. She used another part to put down payment on a small house of her own on the edge of Briar Hollow, nothing like the Larkspur House in size or history, but hers outright from the first signature, her name, and only her name on every document. She kept a copy of her grandmother's original 1983 deed framed on the wall of her new living room, not out of sentimentality exactly, but as a kind of reminder. Some things stay true even when everyone around you has stopped checking. Wallace and Priya married eventually, in the spring, in a small ceremony at a venue in Montpelier that had nothing to do with land Corinne had ever touched. She heard about it from Fern, as she heard about most things now, and found she could hear the news without much feeling attached to it at all, which felt like its own kind of ending. The following winter, Corinne started volunteering 1 evening a week at a legal aid clinic in Briar Hollow, helping women navigate exactly the kind of paperwork confusion that had almost cost her everything. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't pretend to be. But she'd learned the hard way how easy it was for ownership to blur inside a marriage, how many women signed things without reading every line because trust made that feel reasonable at the time, and how often nobody thought to check a county record until it was almost too late to matter. She helped 3 women in her first 2 months find gaps in their own property paperwork, small oversights that, left unchecked, could have cost them the same way Corinne had nearly lost her grandmother's land. She still thought about Odile sometimes, sitting at that Thanksgiving table years ago, saying the girl's the only one who won't sell it. Her grandmother hadn't been protecting Corinne from selling the land. She'd been protecting her from ever fully losing track of what was hers, even when everyone around her assumed otherwise, even when she assumed otherwise herself for the better part of a decade. That protection had waited quietly in a filing cabinet for 41 years, patient in a way only paperwork can be, until the day someone finally thought to look. Corinne kept working at the hospital, kept helping at the clinic on Thursday evenings, kept living in her small house with her grandmother's deed framed on the wall. She hadn't set out to become someone's cautionary tale or anyone's inspiration. She'd just refused to sign something she didn't understand, and it turned out that refusal was worth more than she'd ever imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.